hope in Senegal, how reforesting mangroves is helping to keep rising sea levels at bay. Hello and welcome to the Daily Climate Show, live from the heart of the COP26 summit in Glasgow. And there's no doubt that today's star attraction here was former US President Barack Obama, who warned not nearly enough is being done to address the climate crisis. The start of week 2 of the conference was marked by ministers arriving for the political stage of negotiations. But for all the continued talk here in Glasgow, developing nations say they desperately need more cash to cope with the impacts of climate change, ruining lives and livelihoods around the world right now. Our science and technology editor, Tom Clark, reports now on the key developments from a day focused on adaptation.
Just as energy and optimism is fading, Barack Obama arrived in Glasgow with a half-time call to arms.
Mr. Obama, you hope for progress? Collectively and individually, we are still falling short. We have not done nearly enough to address this crisis. I have to confess, it was particularly discouraging to see the leaders of two of the world's largest emitters, China and Russia, decline to even attend the proceedings. And their national plans so far reflect what appears to be a dangerous lack of urgency, a willingness to maintain the status quo on the part of those governments.
Can you say there's no time to waste? Say there's no time to waste.
You can see from all the excitement around President Obama, he's bringing a much-needed injection of enthusiasm into this flagging summit. But what it really needs is an injection of cash.
His speech got a standing ovation, but 12 years on from the Copenhagen climate talks, a $100 billion pledge for poor countries the US unveiled still hasn't materialised. It's damaged trust in the rich nation's commitment to helping poor countries adapt to a world they didn't make warmer.
I want leaders to acknowledge that loss and damage is here with us now. Communities from countries like mine in the global south, they're already on the front lines of the climate crisis. There are things that we can no longer adapt to. We cannot adapt to extinction. We cannot adapt to starvation. We cannot adapt to our lost cultures or our lost traditions or our lost identities.
There has been new money pledged for adaptation at these talks, $3 billion from the US last week and nearly $275 million from our government today. But will it materialise? He can pull a crowd, but Mr. Obama only secured a third of the green finance money his administration promised in Paris.
We're not losing hope, we're not losing faith. We're continuing to believe that it can become a reality. Because without that becoming a reality, what do we have? Where do we go? So we don't want to lose that faith and we don't want to lose that hope.
But it is being stretched towards the end of this.
It is. But as I said, we're not losing faith and we're not losing hope.
Faith and hope are what these talks need right now, that and a lot more ambition. Otherwise, an even more difficult task gets passed on to the next COP, a year from now and a year closer to the worst of climate change. Tom Clark, Sky News, Glasgow.
Well, we heard there in Tom's piece from the climate justice activist Vanessa Nakate, whose home Uganda is on the front line of climate change. Well, earlier I spoke to her, along with Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon, about the challenges of moving countries whose people rely so heavily on fossil fuels away from them.
It's not enough for me to say stop something or don't do something. I've also got to look in the eye people who work in that industry and say, how are we going to justly transition you to the alternatives, and how are we going to build up the alternative sources of energy to reduce our dependence on oil and gas? I'm determined to do that. It's one of the tough issues for a country like Scotland.
Climate justice should not mean that people are going to lose their jobs. That's why we say we need to stop development of all new fossil fuel projects, because this will allow for an easier transition for people, for communities, to a more sustainable world. And when it comes to countries like mine are also facing the pressure of transitioning, the pressure of developing without coal or without oil or without gas. But how is this going to be possible without climate finance?
Australia has said it intends to continue selling coal decades into the future, despite pledges at the COP26 summit for more than 40 countries to reduce their dependence on the fossil fuel. The country's Resources Minister, Keith Pitt, said the government had been clear it wouldn't be closing coal mines or coal-fired power stations. Well, Australia is the world's second largest exporter of coal, and the fossil fuel is the country's largest energy resource. Between 2018 and 2019, the total value of coal exports in Australia was nearly $70 billion. Most of the coal, destined for foreign markets, is produced in the Hunter Valley in New South Wales. The state accounts for around 40% of all coal production in Australia. Sky correspondent Siobhan Robbins reports now from Muswellbrook in the Upper Hunter Valley.
This is coal country. In the Hunter Valley, a 13,000-strong workforce dig and mine this land. Australians building fortunes and futures from the black gold they pull from the earth.
Coal is so important to this area and to this community. We believe that we've got another 30 years left of this industry to continue selling coal all around the world. So the last piece of coal that's burnt in the world should be Hunter Valley black coal.
If we turned off coal now, what would happen here?
We would see social devastation and in terms of jobs lost, businesses going bankrupt, and people moving away from this area.
This community isn't just built on coal, it's intertwined in the very fabric of society. People have given their lives to the mines. The mines have given livelihoods to tens of thousands of people. The COP26 call to phase out coal power has gone unanswered in Australia, a move supported by many here.
What these guys are attempting to do is put a dead man switch in on a certain date and say that's it. Now what happens if you don't meet that? Are we going to do rolling blackouts?
So are you willing to roll the dice and risk potentially the planet dying?
No, I'm not saying that we should do nothing. There are things that we can do to reduce the carbon output. But I don't think that putting a switch in, which is going to act like a nuclear bomb on our economies, is a good idea.
This is the side of the house that faces all of the bides, but this has gotten worse.
But even in coal country, fears over pollution and climate change have started causing divisions.
So what is that you're wiping off?
Coal dust. It makes me angry, it makes me worried. I mean, that's in my lungs too.
Margot's family once made its money from mining, but for Australia to have a future, she thinks coal has to be left in the past. The government has boosted solar and wind power, pledged net zero emissions by 2050, but it's also signed off new mines.
We're about to dig up more dirt and dig up more tonnes of coal for many more years. We just can't be doing it anymore for the climate. I think the bell has sounded and it is time for the coal industries to start transitioning out of it.
This isn't just a domestic battle. Australia is the world's second biggest exporter of coal, a global dealer of the planet's filthiest fossil fuel.
These communities have fought and died for coal. If Australia bows to pressure, what happens to the people living here? If it doesn't, what happens to the rest of the world? Is this a curtain call for coal?
No, I don't believe it is. I mean, have a look in the backdrop of COP, you've got record high coal demand all around the world. So if there was a last stand to be made on coal, it should be here in this country.
The balance of energy, economics and the environment struck here will impact all of our lives. Australia is now facing its most important power struggle. Siobhan Robbins, Sky News, New South Wales.
Well, let's take a look at some of the day's other climate news from COP26 and also from around the world. And at least 503 fossil fuel lobbyists affiliated with some of the world's biggest oil and gas companies have been given access to COP26, according to an analysis of attendees by Global Witness. Researchers say if the fossil fuel lobby were a country delegation at the climate summit, it would be the biggest, with 24 more attendees than the largest nation. Authorities in the south of India have evacuated low-lying areas after heavy rainfall triggered flooding overnight. The Indian Meteorological Department issued moderate to high flash flood warnings for several districts where significant rainfall is expected for another 4 days. And NASA has released the first images of Earth taken by a new mission designed to capture high-resolution snapshots of the planet to help track climate change. These pictures, including the Florida Panhandle and Kathmandu in Nepal, were taken by the Landsat 9 mission on the 31st of October for the joint project between NASA and the US Geological Survey. Now, as we've been hearing, today's focus here at the COP26 summit is adaptation, and there are warnings that one area of the UK could become uninhabitable if action isn't taken to tackle climate change. The Isles of Scilly off the coast of Cornwall has published a major action plan because of the severe risk of flooding to homes, transport, water supplies and wildlife, as our West of England correspondent Dan Whitehead reports.
28 miles off the tip of Cornwall, a climate emergency is unfolding. Less than 1,000 years ago, the Isles of Scilly was a single landmass. Now it's 140 islands and 2,000 residents are battling the impact of rising sea levels and intense storms.
This is the main defence of our water supply, which is just the other side of this bank.
Protecting the island's water from sea contamination is just one of the plans to ensure that future generations can still live here.
What's the worst case scenario for the people of the Isles of Scilly?
Well, evacuation, basically, because we wouldn't be able to live here. I'm not talking about the next 10 years, 20 or even 100 years, but it could eventually lead to evacuation.
The council says it must robustly defend the islands and is spending millions on protecting its coastline, homes and businesses.
The majority of the population lives here in Hewtown, but it's also one of the most vulnerable parts of the Isles. At its narrowest, it's around 130 metres wide, sandwiched between two beaches. Climate change is literally squeezing and eroding this community.
20 minutes by boat and we arrive at St Agnes, population 80. Farmers Aidan and Grace rear cattle, but also grow crops for oils and gin.
So normally we'd be harvesting these plants and they'd be up like this.
Intense dry spells are making business difficult.
Summers like this summer have made us have to rethink completely, and we're having to look at investing in permanent irrigation systems now to see us through. It's just happening too often for us to risk year on year the crops failing.
But climate change isn't just impacting those on land. The Wildlife Trust says in 2017 nearly all seal pups died after being swept out to sea too soon by a series of ferocious storms.
This is the main entrance to the school.
15-year-old Will Schwartz is a climate champion at the island's only school. He's passionate and fearful about the future of the Scillies.
It definitely worries me. The future generations won't be able to have the same experiences over here than I did, than my generation did, which is a little bit sad, and it's a bit worrying because we might already be too late.
This island community is taking action now, knowing climate change is posing an urgent threat to its very way of life.
Well, Dan joins me now live. So, Dan, what's the way forward then?
Well,
Well, the Isles of Scilly has today been holding a major online summit, a COP26 summit, and they've also published their climate change action plan. It's gone out to public consultation to the 2,000 or so residents who will have a chance to put their input in over the next couple of months on how they should tackle climate change. We've been hearing about adaptation all day at COP26. Nowhere in the UK needs to adapt more than the Isles of Scilly, according to authorities here. And while they are working on mitigations, so they have big plans for extra solar, more electrical vehicles and so forth, it really is the adaptation that is going to be key. They are spending millions of pounds and have been carrying out survey work this week on raising those sea barriers, raising those defences to protect the water supply, to protect the roads, to protect the businesses. You might just be able to make out behind me here. We're obviously by the harbour in Hewtown, and that water is lapping against those people's homes. I was chatting to one gentleman here who says that the water spray comes up on his window even when there's a mild wind. So it really is an issue which the islanders are facing. It is not an issue which is going to be critical for them in the next 10, 20 or even 100 years. But the Council is keen to stress, and they put in writing today, that they have to take urgent and robust action now. And if they can't, then these people's children and their grandchildren simply will not be able to live here anymore.
Dan, thank you. Now, one nature-based solution to help tackle climate change is mangroves. The trees grow in seawater, they help capture carbon dioxide, protect coastal areas from erosion and storm surges, and provide important habitats for a wide variety of species. And for one community in Senegal, reforesting mangroves is helping them deal with the impacts of the climate crisis.
Reboisement moom njëriñ bu bari moo ci nekk ndax tey boo gisee géej gi jëlul suñu dëkk bi lu ñuy reboiser moo tax waaye bu ñu bàyyi woon ni mangrove bi dee ba dara nekkatu ci géej gi day am doole pour yegg si suñu dëkk yi waaye booy reboiser gis nga poto bi nu mu taajoo si mangrove bi day tax géej gi du mun a am doole pour yegg si kaw dëkk bi. ba ma dalee commencé liggéey bi yokkute bu bari am nañ ko ci ndax xamuñ woon ne dañuy élever ay yoxos xamuñ woon tam dañuy def pépinière yoxos ba mu mun a màgg. fu mu nekk ni wàññeeku na si ñun baxalatuñu yoxos di ko weer di ci am lu tuuti. boo ko defee transformation boobu ci ngay gën a am lu bëri daal ndax yoxos bu wow boo yóbbee paan dem weer ko du faj dara mais bu dee def nga ko transformation dugal ko ci bocal yi tuuti ngay jël mu fees bocal nga dem jaayi ko.
Now we're getting to discussing all of the climate issues of the day now, and I'm joined by the chair of the Adaptation Subcommittee of the Committee on Climate Change, Dame Julia King, and the director of the Energy and Climate think tank, Power Shift Africa, Mohamed Adal. So welcome to both of you. Mohamed, first of all, how important is the issue of adaptation for those communities who are already suffering from climate change? And do you feel this conference has given enough attention to it? We've had a whole day today, haven't we, focused on it?
Unfortunately, we haven't actually even started addressing adaptation and loss and damage at the scale that it's required. If you think about the 30 years of negotiations, the world hasn't been able to catalyze the global action that is needed, particularly to reduce emissions, but also, more importantly, to be able to meaningfully provide support to those who are vulnerable and living on the front line. If you think about the communities now suffering some of the worst impact of climate change, we're not extending much support to them. We've left them to be on their own, and we can't have a climate regime that is only focused on emissions reductions and also failing to deliver enough to hold warming to below 1.5 degrees. And so if we're going to be able to tackle climate change effectively, we need to start getting seriously about adaptation so that we can actually survive some of the predicted impacts of climate change.
Dave, Julie, would you agree with that? I mean, and funding is vital, isn't it? We have had some announcements today as far as the Climate Fund is concerned, haven't we? Does it go far enough?
I couldn't agree more with Mohammed. I think he's spot on. I mean, we've been celebrating today hundreds of millions of pounds being committed to adaptation. We're talking about hundreds of billions of pounds for mitigation. We really do need not to take money away from mitigation. We urgently need that, but we really do need to be upping the amount that we're investing in adaptation and the support we're giving to the global south and the developing world.
Well, yes, and on that subject, Mohammed, of course, President Obama was here, caused a bit of a stir at COP26, and it was when he was president in 2009 that the £100 billion a year was promised. It was supposed to be here by last year. It's still not here. How important is that for the success of the whole talks, that money being forthcoming?
Firstly, 100 billion is peanuts if you actually assess that against the real needs of the developing countries who require climate support. But it's what the developed world promised in 2009 and repeated again in 2015 in Paris. But the fact that they haven't actually delivered 100 billion and they can actually talk outside the formal process about 130 trillion that they are planning to mobilize just tells you how these countries are failing to take seriously their past commitments. And this is actually damaging trust. This is the only multilateral system that we have that can help us actually tackle climate change. Now, if you can't honor your past promises, how can we even trust you with anything new you promise?
President Obama also talked about some of those island nations that are suffering right now, being the canary in the coal mine, and why, while clearly that immediate danger needs to be addressed first, we do need to heed that warning, don't we? So what about the UK? You look a lot at adaptation in the UK. How ready are we for climate change?
We're doing better in some areas, like the funding that the Environment Agency now has for flooding, but we're not yet doing enough on heating, for example, on overheating, for example. We haven't yet got round to changing the building regulations so that we're building new homes that are going to be fit for the future. We're not doing enough about water efficiency. So in areas like the one I come from in Cambridgeshire area, by 2050, 40% of our housing could be homes built between now and 2050. We're in a water-stressed area. We need to be able to build those homes to really high water efficiency standards, and yet that's not yet happening. So there are simple things we could be doing that we aren't yet doing, and we really do need to get on with it.
And Mohammed, we're starting the second week, aren't we, of these talks? There's only a few more days to go. So what's your feeling? I know you've been on meetings backstage, if you like, at the conference. So what are you picking up? What's the mood that you think is there?
I think the developing countries, if you talk to them, the mood is very sour because of the past promises that haven't been honored and the fact that important negotiations, including on the global goal on adaptation, if a wealthy country like the UK isn't prepared and can at best be able to only firefight when climate impact actually strike, how important is adaptation, particularly for those climate vulnerable countries who don't have the financial and technological wherewithal that the UK has. And so because of the failure to actually launch important negotiations, including setting the goal for the global goal on adaptation, failing to launch the negotiations that will help us actually define a meaningful long-term climate finance that doesn't just talk about deliver 100 billion, but allows us to shift the trillions that will be required to deliver the emissions reductions that are needed, that will allow us to be able to actually provide meaningful support to those communities that require adaptation support. And also, more importantly, given that we fail to mitigate enough and fail to actually provide sufficient adaptation support, we're now dealing with loss and damage. That residual adverse impact of climate change that we can no longer be able to adapt to. And the small island states, the least developed countries, are not getting any assurance at all from the developed countries.
And I thought from you, Dave, Julia, I know you've arrived today, but what's the mood that's met you?
The mood that's met me, I think, is that we are making some progress on mitigation and the commitments towards reaching net zero. But net zero is critical, but it's not enough. It's not sufficient. We have to have adaptation as well. And whilst I think adaptation is getting a bit more traction, I think, as Mohammed has emphasised so well, we have still got a long way to go to get the right kind of commitments to adaptation.
OK, well, Dame Julia King and Mohammed Addo, really interesting to get your thoughts here with just a few more days now to go of COP26. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.